pray for Opal and pray for the rest of the family as well at this time. This morning I want to touch on a subject as we prepared this series on the attributes of God and tried to put it together in some way that it would kind of coincide with Christmas. We tried to pick those attributes that had more to do with Christmas and put them more into the area of December so that we would kind of combine those things together. Well, this morning's message is on the fact that God is just. And I'm sure you're probably thinking to yourself, now wait a minute, this is supposed to be the bright and wonderful time of Christmas, and Pastor Lowder is going to get up there and he's talking about that God is just, and he's going to bawl us out, and he's going to really point his finger and say, y'all, you bunch of sinners, and so on. But I hope tonight, this morning, that will not be the case as we look at this, because this particular message really has a tremendous, I kind of call it the bookends, because it demonstrates the fact that when we think about Christmas and we think about the aspects of Christmas, we would not need Christmas were it not for the justice of God. The fact that God is just, therefore we need Christmas. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that this morning, and hopefully as we look into this that we'll be able to kind of unpackage it a little bit and really get excited about the fact that God is just. He's not, and I'll fill in that word in a few minutes, but because of the fact that we have a just and a holy and righteous God, therefore we can enjoy today the aspects of Christmas and the aspects of the work of Christ, and along with the fact that we have the birth of Christ and we have the death of Christ represented obviously in the communion service today. So we have those two bookends that really are really tied directly to this subject of the justice of God. We want to look this morning at three perspectives on this, and I really worked to try to figure out exactly how to say this. There is so much in this material, and I want to kind of narrow it down, and I don't want this necessarily to be a really strictly a teaching message, but yet there'll be quite a bit of that in here, because until we understand the difference in terminology and some of these things, we're never really going to appreciate this aspect, the fact that God is just. I want you to go back with the passage that Pastor Zach read this morning, back to Deuteronomy chapter 32. In Deuteronomy chapter 32, we have some statements here. But as you're turning back there, I hope you realize the tremendous battle that we are in this country, especially with the war that's going on between the biblical view of justice and the world view of justice. There is a huge difference. There's a huge discrepancy that's there, and we're hearing more and more and more about some of these different things, and I think there's created a lot of confusion, even in Christians' minds. There's a lot of confusion about this as well. The setting for Deuteronomy 32 is the fact that that Moses now has come to the end of his ministry. He's now 120 years old. He has experienced numbers of things. The first 40 years he grew up in Pharaoh's palace. The second 40 years he was on the backside of the desert feeding sheep. The last 40 years he was leading the children of Israel through the wilderness wandering. He's come now to the end of his life. He's writing and he's preaching, he's teaching Deuteronomy. He's giving this material to the children of Israel. He's explaining to them what they need to do. We looked at some of those things a couple weeks ago. But now here, it's entitled Moses' Song in this first part of chapter 32 here. And it's interesting, some of the wording that he uses, because it harkens back to lessons that he has learned in his life. The reason he's standing here today, at this particular day, and the reason that it's going to say when he gets over to the end of chapter 32, that he's going to be saying, okay, Moses, now it's your time, go up in the mountain, you're going to die right now. And there's a reason for that, and it goes back, but it's also picked up a little bit in the statement here in this 32nd chapter, beginning of verse 1. Give ear, O heavens, and I will speak, and hear, O earth, thy word, the word of my mouth. My doctrine shall drop as rain, my speech shall distill as the dew, as the small rain upon the tender herb, and as the showers upon the grass. Because I will proclaim the name of the Lord, ascribe to greatness unto our God. Moses had experienced, Moses had lived tremendous experiences in his life. The time that he confronted Pharaoh and all of the 10 plagues that happened, crossing the Red Sea, seeing the miracles in the wilderness as all of the things took place there. The shoes didn't wear out, the clothing didn't wear out, food was provided constantly. All these things that he was experiencing, and he could look back and talk about the greatness of God. But notice in verse 4, he says, he is the rock. Now, why does he use that particular term? I think for good reason. Because when he first entered the land after crossing the Red Sea, the people came to him and said, we have no water. We don't have any food. Give us water. We should have stayed back in Egypt. And so what did Moses do? Moses went up to the rock and he struck the rock and water gushed forth. A little bit later on in Numbers chapter 20, it says also that the people came to Moses and said to Moses, Moses, we don't have any water. And by this time, Moses was kind of upset with the people. And he saw again the rock, and this time, rather than doing what God said, because he said, listen, he said, what you are supposed to do now, he said, I want you to speak to the rock, and water will come forth. Moses getting very upset with the people and very anxious and very troubled by the whole situation. He goes up and he strikes the rock again. And God said, you're going to die. Because he said, I told you to speak to it, and you struck it. Now we know from Corinthians that rock that followed them was Christ. And the thing about the teaching, and the thing that I think that David, or that Moses had to learn, was that Christ was only to be struck once, never to die again. And it's an injustice and a disservice to God, to those that would say that you have to keep crucifying Christ over and over and over and over again, because that's unbiblical. Moses lost his life because he did that. And here, as he is coming to the end of his life, he has learned his lesson. He's about to die because God is just. He is about to die because God follows his word. God speaks his word, he makes the promises, he speaks the truth, and he carries it out. And so what he says here in verse 4, he says, he is the rock. His work is perfect, for all his ways are just, a God of truth and without iniquity, just and right is he. Moses had learned who God was. Moses had learned about this idea of justice. And so the question comes, well, what is justice? Well, I must confess that I'm going to read notes to you this morning for a couple minutes here, just because I found some, what I would consider some pretty good definitions, and I would share them with you, and then I'm going to tell you what justice is not. Justice is to give everyone his due. God's justice is the rectitude of his nature, whereby he is carried to the doing of that which is righteous and equal. God will always do the right thing. It's interesting that justice and righteousness, or just and righteousness, are really kind of interchangeable as far as the words of the Old Testament are concerned, and especially in the New Testament. And we'll see that when we get into Romans. But the idea is that God is truth, God is justice. Remember, Christ said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father but by me. So God always does that which is right and which is equal. Justice is the impartial application of the law as derived from the principles of natural law. It is rooted in universal principle that applies to all people. In other words, there are things that are absolutely true. They're true all the time, every time. And God applies to that his actions and the things that he does. Word is often translated righteousness, and justice works in two areas. It works in the area of punishment, but also works in the area of reward. And it's interesting that this word is found numerous times throughout the Old Testament. But what is it not? Justice is not fairness. So when you say the term fair is only used just a couple times in Scripture, and it's generally referred to what an individual does to another individual. Fairness is never equated to God in the Bible. Justice is, because they are very, very different concepts. The idea of fairness is found in the principle or in the notion of what ought to be as opposed to what is. We are living today, as I mentioned before, we're living today in a society where everybody is crying out, that's not fair. Matter of fact, a good illustration of that was found in our family. I don't often use my grandchildren as examples, even though they're perfect examples of many different things. But one of the things was that Maddie gets to go to Sight and Sound on Tuesday. By the way, those of you going to Sight and Sound, if you live north, we'll meet at Clearbrook. If you live south, we'll meet here. So see me afterwards, I'll tell you all about that. But anyway, Maddie gets to go to Sight and Sound with us on Tuesday. Tommy finds out about the fact that Maddie's going to Sight and Sound on Tuesday. And all of a sudden, this is not really going over very well for Tommy. And he's sitting back there and he's thinking about this and thinking about this and thinking about this. And finally he says to Maddie, he said, I'm not going to invite you to my birthday party. Because you see, fairness from Tommy's perspective and from many people's perspective was the fact that everybody gets to do everything. There's no criteria. There's no standard. There's nothing that gauges by. Everybody just gets to do the same thing. You know, we talk about fair wages, and we talk about a lot of things in life, and the whole concept is that fairness. It's interesting. A comment that I read was that fairness provides no protection to the individual, nor does it provide for a reasoned path of correction. In fact, fairness admits to the right to make a law as necessary to further the purpose for whatever is believed should be as opposed to what is. Let me read that again. Fairness provides no protections to the individual, nor does it provide for a reasoned path of correction. In fact, fairness admits to the right to make law as necessary to further the purpose for which it is believed should be, as opposed to what is. You apply that definition over so much of what is going on today in society. And we have a society that has reversed justice for fairness. They have taken the idea that we need to be socially engineering everything because that's fair. And so we will make laws, we will do all sorts of things to bring everything into line what we think it should be. God doesn't work on that. God works on the policy that he is God, because you remember when we were talking about these attributes, and one of the problems that we're having is that each week we've taken one attribute. We talked about his omniscience, his omnipresence, his omnipotence, he's talked about his unity, he's talked about his faithfulness. We've talked about all these things, and we've kind of spread them out over the weeks, and in doing so, it's like, okay, today God is just. No, that is built upon, and he's 100% of all these other things at the same time. And so what we have is that God, as a God of justice, will always do what is right. It's interesting, and that's what Moses was saying, and Job said it, others have said it as well. It's also not present-day social justice. It's a very different thing from that. What we have in social justice today is manufactured equality of outcome in cases where incidental inequities appear in a procedurally just system. Now you say, what in the world does that all say? Well, it's simply this, that justice does not guarantee equal outcome. Justice guarantees equal opportunity, but justice does not guarantee equal income. So not everybody gets the same thing all the time. Life is not fair. That is a true statement. Life is not fair. There are going to be people that will benefit greatly. There will be people that will not benefit at all. Life is not fair. We try that life should be just, but life is not fair. So that what that means is when God says that the wages of sin is death, a just God has to carry that out and accomplish what he has said he would do to sin, because the wages of sin is death, separation from God. He has to do that because that is he's a just God. But now that justice also can show itself in mercy or in grace, and we're going to be covering those things in the next couple weeks. It can be showing itself in some of those things, because just because God's justice says it has to be done, if he chooses to be gracious and if he chooses not to give that doesn't mean that God he may not be fair as we think about it, but that doesn't mean he's unjust. And I want to show you that a little bit when we go to the next section, and that is Matthew chapter 20. This is a parable that is given by the Lord, Matthew chapter 20, and it's dealing primarily, and I don't have time today to unpackage the whole thing, but it came about as a result of some of the issues with the disciples. And so he tells this story, he gives this account. But I think it's an account that really gives us a good, clear picture of this idea of justice. What happens is, and he tells the account here, now remember now, the kingdom of heaven, as it's described in Matthew, always refers to the 1,000-year kingdom. So keep that in mind. We're dealing with something that's yet future during the millennial kingdom. But the application, I think, and the truth of the story will benefit our understanding of justice today. It says, for the kingdom of heaven is like a man that is an householder who went out early in the morning to hire laborers into his vineyard. And when he had agreed with the laborers for a denarius a day, he sent them into his vineyard. And he went out about the third hour and saw others standing idle in the marketplace, and said unto them, go ye also into the vineyard, and whatever is right I will give you. And they went their way. Again he went out about the 6th and 9th hour, and did the same. About the 11th hour he went out and found others standing idle, and said unto them, why stand ye here all day idle? And they said unto him, because no man hath hired us. He said unto them, go ye also into the vineyard, and whatsoever is right, that will you receive. So when the evening was come, the Lord of the vineyard said unto his steward, call the laborers, and give them their hire, beginning from the last unto the first, which is an interesting way of doing it. And when they came that were hired about the 11th hour, they received every man a denarius. But when the first came, they supposed that they should have received more, and they likewise received every man a denarius. And when they had received a denarius, they murmured against the householder, saying, These last have worked but 1 hour, and thou hast made them equal unto us, who have borne the burden and heat of the day. But he answered one of them and said, Friend, I do thee no wrong. Didst not thou agree with me for a denarius? Take what is thine and go thy way. I will give unto this last even as unto thee. Is it not lawful for me to do that what I will with mine own? Is mine eye evil because I am good? And so with this in mind, with this story in mind, how many times doesn't that play out even in the workforce today? And there's a lot of things that that I could say about this, but we'll pick up with just a couple of them. Number one, the master owns the vineyard. It's his vineyard, it's his work. And the idea today is, you see, that if somebody has things and has more than somebody else, they must have got it in a corrupt way. There's no concept of the idea that somebody actually could have legitimately have a fortune. Anybody that has a fortune today is made to appear as though they have cheated or corrupted or somebody to get what they have, and so it's unjust gain. And there is issues in the Bible, and there are people out there that is very true. But the master here, apparently in this situation that the Lord's using here, had owned the vineyard, and it was his vineyard, his money, and he could do with it as he pleased. So what happens is that, and also too, from the story, there were a lot of people out of work. And they were just standing around, and they were hoping that somebody would hire them, and so they were just standing around, walking around, and the master comes up to them and says to them, do you need a job? And he says, yeah, I need a job. Now the interesting thing is that the only person or people that he specifically gives a salary amount to are the people that were hired first in the morning. And he says to those people, he said, I will give you a denarius, which was a day's wages. I will give you a day's wages for a day's work. And they said, we'll take it. Great. They go out there, they work. All of a sudden, some guys come in a couple hours later. Some more guys come in a couple hours later. And here comes some guys coming in right just before quitting time. And you probably have had people like that you know. And they show up just before quitting time. Now, the interesting thing about it is that, and I think what was happening was, and in the story here, God wanted to prove a point. And that point was, he says, okay, we're going to start with the people that were hired at the 11th hour, just before quitting time. And so he brings them in, and he hands them a denarius. Now, what happens to the rest of the people? Ooh, this guy is generous. Now, notice the statement here in verse 3. It says, and he went out about the 3rd hour and saw others standing idle in the marketplace, and said unto them, go into the vineyard, and whatsoever is right, and the word right there is the word just. Whatever is just, I'll give to you. I'm not going to cheat you. I will give you an honest wage. Now, remember, justice will never cheat. But justice can, if it chooses to do so, benefit or bless or provide extra if he wants to. Justice does not demand that, okay, he gives the first guy a denarius and the last guy 1/8 of a denarius. He's not required to do that. As long as he doesn't cheat the first guy, he is free to do whatever he wants to do with the rest. What happens? Well, also too, and he does the same thing in verse 11, and said to them, why standing here? Verse 7, whatever is right, same thing. Whatever is just, that shall you receive. Well, what happens Well, the guys that were hired first got the denarius, and the master makes no bones about it, and he just simply hands the denarius to the 11th hour guy, and almost like, you see that? And what happens to the guys that had been working all day? Oh, this guy's a generous boss. You know what? He's going to really give me extra. And the guy that had been there, and he pays everybody a denarius. And he gets to the first guys, and he gives them a denarius. And he says, what? A denarius? Thought you'd give me more than that. He said, didn't we contract for a denarius? You know, see? Am I just? Was this master just? Absolutely. He did not cheat the first guy. He had a contract. He had an agreement with them that he would pay them so much. And they agreed to go to work, and they went to work, and they worked all day for that. So they were very just. But the thing is, justice requires that the penalty is never unjust or never unequal or never extreme to the crime. But a just God is able to give extra and benefit if he chooses to do so. Go with me to Romans chapter 3. I'll show you what I mean. Romans chapter 3. Now, I'm not going to take the time to go all the way back to, I'll start there in verse 19, I guess. Now we know that whatsoever things the law saith, it saith to them who are under the law, that every mouth may be stopped and all the world may become guilty before God. What did the law do? The law simply said, okay, here's God's standard. And he said specifically, if you don't keep every one of those commands, and you become guilty of one of those, just one of them, you're guilty of the whole thing. Wages of sin is death. Stand before God guilty. The nations of it, the Gentile nations stood before God guilty. They didn't have God. They didn't have anything. They didn't have any hope. They had absolutely nothing. And what happens is, God said, in his justice, man sinned. I don't owe man anything. Man has no standing whatsoever before me. But if I want to be gracious to somebody, that's my prerogative. I don't have to be. Every man that stands before the great white throne judgment is going to stand there. Two things. One, is their name written in the book of life. Two, they'll be judged according to their works. God is just in condemning sinners to the lake of fire forever, not because he doesn't like them, but simply because of the fact they have sinned. And so what he's dealing with here in this third chapter is the justice of God, and how does God deal with that? How does he still remain just and bless people? Well, the answer is given here. Notice verse 20. Therefore, by the deeds of the law, there shall no flesh be justified, declared righteous. And notice wherever you see justified or just or righteous in this verse, you know it's exactly the same word. Some of your translations translate better than others, but justice, just, and righteousness are all the same word, all the same Greek word here. So, therefore, by the deeds of the law, there shall no man be declared righteous or justified in his sight. For by the law is the knowledge of sin. So, the law and our nature said, I'm guilty. You have every right to treat me according to my sin. And that's what justice would do. But notice he goes on in 21. But now, the righteousness or the justice of God apart from the law is manifest, being witnessed by the law and the prophets, even the righteousness of God which is by faith of Jesus Christ unto all and upon all them that believe, for there is no difference. For all have sinned and come short of the glory of God, being justified, declared righteous, freely by his grace through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus, whom God has set forth to be a propitiation or a satisfaction through faith in his blood, to declare his righteousness for the remission of sins that are past through the forbearance of God, to declare, I say, that at this time his righteousness, that he might be what? He might be just, because that's who he is, but also be the justifier of him who believes in Jesus. Wow. What do we have here? We have a just God that says, I have to punish sin. I have to give every man according to his works, because all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. I've got to do something about that. And I have to give him his wages, which is death, separation from me. That's what I have to give him. Unless in my graciousness, in my love, in my desire to help that person, I can provide something else, some way that will not offend my justice, but will give to those above and beyond. Remember these individuals that were working for the man? He had to give, his justice required him to give a denarius to the first guy. But his justice allowed him to give the others above and beyond. And if you don't understand that you have been privileged to not simply be a part of God's justice, but the fact that he is just and the justifier, we are here today as an illustration of that. We have the decorations for Christmas. How did God remain just and also bless us? Well, it's very simple. He provided Christ. His justice demanded, it says, without the shedding of blood, there's no remission. So there has to be some type of payment for sin. We couldn't do it. So what has to happen is that someone has to become a man who has no sin, that would come down and provide and become sin and die, so that we could still have a God that's just and he could still be the justifier. And he accomplishes that with no one else but himself. When he, the Son, Jesus Christ, says to the Father, I'll go. I'll do it. And he comes down. But you see, in order to do that, what has to happen? He has to be a man. As a man, he now has blood. He now has the capabilities of every other man. And he is a sinless man. Now when he dies, he pays for our sin. So we have to have Christmas. That's the opening bookend. We have to have the crucifixion and the resurrection. That's the conclusion. So that he could be, notice, and he says, the only way you're going to get that, you see, those guys went into the field. The guys that were hired on the 3rd and the 6th and the 9th and the 11th, they had no idea how much they were going to get. The only thing they were told was, I will be just to you. I will give you a just wage. Now, fairness, you see, fairness would have treated very differently. And fairness would have not responded in that way at all. But God is not fair. God is just. Fairness would have said, hey, wait a minute. Look at Andy Hensley. I'm a lot better than Andy. You know, I'm a preacher. He's just a real estate agent. And obviously, real estate agent is not, But the point is, you see, this is not the way it works, is it? See, that's the wonderful thing about standing before God. He says, it's not according to our works, lest any man should boast. Boy, can you imagine the pushing and shoving at the throne of heaven if it was based upon our works? It'd be terrible. just terrible. We all stand there sinners that God justly could have sent to hell, but he chose instead of that, because we have responded to the work of Christ, and by faith we have believed that what Christ did on the cross 2,000 years ago was for me personally and for you personally. We responded to it. As a result of that, I am declared righteous. I'm declared just before God. What a position. What a blessing. God, that owner of the vineyard could have said to the guy in the 11th hour, and he had every right to do so, he could have said, sorry guys, you worked for free today. Because he wasn't obligated to them to do anything. But he was gracious to them. It's the same way with us today. As we stand before God today, we stand purely in his grace. Because he's a just God, but thank God that he's a justifier of those that believe. God is just, therefore he will never punish us more than we deserve. But he may reward us more than we deserve. Did you ever notice that we are very quick to want justice and righteousness done to others, but we are a little less likely and less desirous of having it done to us? You know, today we have both parts of justice portrayed. Christmas is his provision of a perfect man to satisfy his justice. Only a human could do that. So Christ became a man. Communion is his provision of full payment for our sin, that he might be justified freely from, we might be justified freely from all our sin and stand just and righteous before our just God. We stand before a just God, and the sad part about it is that just as he has been blessed us over and over and over again, those that have never trusted him as personal Savior, he will give them everything that they deserve. What a day that will be. Terrible day, because of the fact that they simply rejected the gift of eternal life. Life is not fair. I have no explanation why it is that some people can go through life and have no problems at all. Everything they touch works out perfectly fine. Everything is just wonderful. And the next person is just like that little guy that walked around in little Abner that had that cloud that just kept raining on him all the time, no matter where he went. And there are people like that. Does that mean that God is unfair? No. You see, every one of us should have a cloud. Every one of us. Really, there's no reason why we should even be living. No reason why we should be living in America. No reason why we should be living in this area. And no reason why you should be at this church with all these wonderful people. There's no reason. Except the fact that God has been gracious. And God's given us so much of what we didn't deserve. We didn't deserve anything. But here is a just God who simply says in his goodness and love and graciousness, I'm going to give you some things that you don't deserve. I'm going to bless you. And we're the recipients of it. And so what we have is we come to communion.